All right, here we go again. Delighted again that we can be back together. In this session, we're going to take about 30 minutes and then we're going to have Q&A. And so I want you to begin to think about that. I appreciate so much our opportunity to dialogue. The challenge of the cities. When I began counting cities as the Lausanne coordinator for world evangelism back in 1979, there were 240 cities of 1 million or more people. Today there are about 510, and cities are growing at over 100,000 persons per week. If you can get your head around this, how many people in Canada? 34 million? 35 million? Pretty close. That's how many people will leave rural China for urban China this year. If you can imagine every single Canadian relocating every single year. This is the greatest migration in human history. It is rural China migrating to urban China. It is planned. It is out of control. There are at least 100 million people in China that are called floating Chinese. They have no permanent address. The gospel is in the midst of this migration. Africa, same thing is happening. Rural to urban, massive, plus birth rates. So that we see cities are becoming the catch basins of the nations, and cities are global, and the migrant streams go in and out on all 6 continents. That is happening around the world. And we could talk a lot about that. Now, the challenges of all that are many, and I'll just review a handful because you're all involved in them. One is just the sheer demographics are just numbing. Just the absolute numbers of people flocking into cities makes our small and quiet and even exciting ministries seem inconsequential in some ways. That's a challenge. Secondly, the costs are going up. It is very expensive to do ministry. If I were to ask for your church missionary to give me $1 million so I can make a down payment on a condo in the Hancock building in Chicago, 28,000 people live in one building. A normal city of 28,000 would have 28 churches. About a church per 1,000 is the U.S. average in small rural America. If I came to your committee and said, I have just discovered a city of 28,000 with no church, would you partner with me? Now, first of all, I need to get inside the building because of the doorman. This building has 28,000 people, of whom 12,500 live in and commute inside the building to their work. They never have to leave it. How do you reach a world like that? 90% of urban people come to Christ through relationships. How do you sell a church on the idea of planting people inside high-rise buildings? If you have an established church, what I say is perhaps you would consider getting a second mortgage under your property, go to the bank and create a land banking scheme where you can buy condos in every one of the towers, buildings within a half mile of your congregation, so that you literally have people ministering inside those towers. We have to think this way because the cities are rezoning, which is a way of taxing the airspace. They're imploding the value of the land to create this reality. And the evangelical churches basically have sold missions on a grass hutch-thut missionary model. It's cheaper for missionaries to work in jungles than in the city itself. It's not just the church that's being locked out of high-rise buildings, which are the ultimate gated communities. What we call the urban trinity, the pastors, the politicians, and you might say the police, 3 major institutions, are locked out. How to arrest people engaged in crime who are hiding in high-rise buildings is something that law enforcement around the world is trying to deal with. So cities present challenges. The rapid growth, the pluralism, the costs. Another aspect is used to be that the Catholic Church, the evangelicals, and we had synagogues. Today we have, of course, the mosques, the temples of Asia. Our kids are in the same environments of kids who are from all these countries and all these religions. And so we're getting the theological pluralism. We're getting a challenge to denominations. Who are you and what do you believe? What is your place at the table? The leadership challenge is huge because in the city, almost everybody is operating cross-culturally. I mean, it's less so in Canada, certainly less so in Vancouver. You don't have a huge black population, for example. And the United States is maybe somewhat typical of the way you're moving. The United States is now the second largest Spanish country in the world. Only Mexico has more Spanish language people than the U.S. We have passed Argentina, Colombia. The United States is fourth or fifth largest black nation in the world today. We're by far the largest Jewish nation. We're by far the largest Scandinavian and Irish nation. We're becoming the catch basin of nations. And as they gravitate, it's predictable where they go. Lebanese go to Detroit. The Coptic Egyptians go to Fairfax, Virginia, or to Los Angeles. The Syrians go to Burbank. The Armenians go to Glendale. The Afghans go to Fremont, California. Hmong end up in Minneapolis. It's interesting to trace these streams, and that is true in this country as well as other countries of Europe and Asia. The challenge then is that the church today must be 24/7. Just like supermarkets, police departments, and hospitals, I contend churches to reach a city have to be 24/7. We have to have day pastors and night pastors. We have to work in multi-language teams. Virtually everything missionaries did overseas, we now have to do here at home. And we're not used to thinking that way. We've been a missionary sending country. Now we're also a missionary receiving country as the world moves to the migrant streams. Many of these challenges are coming first in the global south, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And we in the West have had a longer history of this. But I can tell you that the churches that are growing in South America, Asia, and Africa are working in contexts of poverty that are horrific and contexts of rapid change and almost no resources. So this is a problem. Roughly 80% of the world's resources are in the West. About 80% of the world's growth is in the East. The good news is, in 1900, 80% of the world's Christians were white, Northern, and Western, living in North America and Europe. Today, over 50% of the world's Christians are non-white, non-Northern, non-Western. The biggest change in the 2,000-year history of the church has occurred. The church is now, center of gravity is the global south. Obviously, that is good news. People are coming to Christ in enormous numbers in Africa every single day. This is good news. But the problem is many of them are growing up in such poverty they can't resource their own ministries. And we're having to figure out ways that we can do that. That's a huge challenge. Urban churches are developing specializations, and I'll just mention a few. At-risk persons. It's estimated that, because of hospitals that are in the city, pediatrics all the way to geriatrics, we have at-risk people. Street people have been studied. There's a book, it's a classic in American reality, called Nation in Denial, The Truth About Homelessness. Point is that we've discovered that the traditional ministries can help about 15% of street people with the traditional soup, soap, and salvation response. The rest have what we call layered addictions, often beginning with sexual addictions and stuff that go back to childhood. A huge number of street people in our country are veterans of wars, of still suffering the trauma. So the city is full of at-risk people groups. It is estimated the fastest growing group in America, for example, are the 80-year-olds and up, vintage people. Whereas they're competing in the legislatures for funding for the incredibly growing group of impacted children who are born addicted because mothers ate, drank, smoked the wrong stuff. So we have this incredible picture of brain-damaged children who really can't sit in normal schools, requiring very expensive responses, and the aging population competing for the same shrinking budgets, and churches caught in the middle. Who do we help? Remember Mark 5, Jesus walking in the street, he's going to Jairus' house. Hurry, Jesus, the child is dying. And not just any child, it's the 12-year-old daughter of the leader of the synagogue community of the city. Jesus is going through the town and he meets the bag lady who grabs his garment. He stops. Who touched me? Now that's the urban gospel. Jesus can distinguish the accidental touch of the multitude from the one person that reaches out by faith to touch him. When Jesus stops, by the way, the woman is groveling on the street. It suddenly dawned on her what she had done. And if Jairus is looking at her, if looks would kill, she'd be dead. I'm sure he's thinking, do you know what you have just done, bag lady? You have killed my daughter. You have rendered the rabbi unclean. You, a bleeding woman of all people, who are you anyway? What right do you have to do this? Up till this point in the story, it's about two dying women in the city. They're parallel. One's been living for 12 years, the other one's been dying for 12 years. But then in verse 34 of Mark 5, Jesus reaches down and grabs the woman's hand and names her. Remember what he calls her? Daughter. And he transforms the story. It's no longer about two dying women in the city. It's about the fathers of two dying women in the city. Jesus is saying, Jairus, you have a daughter who's dying, and I care, and you care. You should care. Meet my daughter, who's also dying in the city. That story haunts me. Who do you help? The people who pay you to be the pastor? The people outside? This is a dilemma of every urban minister. Who do we help? Who gets our time? Who gets the priority? The more I read the Gospels in this light, the more I'm seeing the practicality of the Gospels as literature and as pastoral care issues, because they raise it. So at-risk persons. Then we have at-risk communities, First Nations, Gypsies, the Roma people of Europe, 20 million of them. 20 million Roma people. I have good news today. Probably the biggest worshiping church every Sunday morning in Berlin is now a Roma church with about 600 in worship. A gypsy church in Berlin with 600 in worship. That's good news, I think. I hope you agree. And this is what we're seeing. These are at-risk communities, neighborhoods that are now dysfunctional, neighborhoods that have been abandoned by the middle classes and unserviced by the mainstream economy. They're the hidden communities of our North American reality, and if you go to Fresno, California, which leads our nation in per capita poverty, you'd be amazed how many people are sleeping in the tunnels, the water tunnels in the dry season. When you look in there, it's like people in like rolled up blankets in burritos. These are people. So you've got not only at-risk people, you've got at-risk communities. Then you've got the multi-ethnic challenge. All the languages are here in Toronto. We have, in my denomination, 141 churches in Los Angeles city limits. 139 languages are spoken in 141 churches. How do you prepare leadership? How do you disciple people in all those languages? These are challenges the city is presenting. No easy answers, no easy biblical responses. If evangelism is scratching people where they itch in the name of Jesus, which is my simple definition, how do we find the itch? How do we scratch? Where do we get the leadership? Who do we help? My city, I've already told you, my neighborhood, we had so many fires, 1,400 fires one year. We collected dossiers, and a group of pastors, we would go to court and challenge slumlords. And we'd tell the stories we documented, and one day we were in court, and every single case was thrown out. One of my pastor friends with a PhD in New Testament, a Wheaton grad, a dear soul, Bill Leslie, LaSalle Street Church. He said, Your Honor, yes, Reverend. If it please the court, may I ask, yes, Reverend, where is the justice in this courtroom? We've been sitting here all day watching you side with slumlords against the poor. The judge didn't bat an eye. He said, Reverend, this is not a court of justice. This is a court of law. If you want justice, change the law. And I realized when I heard that we had to have people in the law courts doing advocacy. We can't save the streets by ourselves. We need a team. I hope you heard me say that when I talked about the three Iranians, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. They had a team approach to doing the work. One of the fun Bible studies I've done all over the world with seminary students and pastors is I put half a group in Philippians and half a group in Colossians. I wish we had time. It'd take about an hour. And I would send you off as Philippians in your room and Colossians, and I would say, I want you to pretend this is your whole Bible. This half, you only get Philippians. This half, you only get Colossians. Now come back in an hour and tell me what would your ministry look like in this city if you just had Philippians and you just had Colossians. My hermeneutical clue is very simple. Pay attention to where Jesus Christ is located in your book and how Jesus is described. When I send people off, they come back, it's almost predictable. 100% comes close every time. On 6 continents I've done this. The Philippian group notices that Jesus lives in the human heart and is powerless. He gave up all that power to come and down and be a human being. Everything in Philippians is high touch. And so the Philippian people come up with church planting, discipleship, prayer walks, prayer groups, prayer ministries, cells, all those personal things. And it's not a surprise that from John Wesley to the present charismatics, Philippians is the heartbeat of that group. And I would put Anabaptist tradition in that model. Now the Colossians basically come back and they've noticed that Jesus is the powerful Christ seated at the right hand of God. Colossians describes Christ as firstborn of all creation and the super glue that holds everything together. In him, everything consists. So the Colossian group comes back with a urban ministry plan that looks like this. We're going to take on toxic waste dumps. We're going to clean up public school systems. We're going to challenge the banks that have been discriminating in loan portfolios against poor or minorities. And the Philippians are listening to this Colossian report saying, what are you drinking? Where'd you get this stuff? My question is, which book is right, Philippians or Colossians? You want to say both, don't you? They came unglued in 1920. One sector of the church, which went modern, took Colossians and went social. Evangelicals panicked, took Philippians, and went personal. How far apart are these books in the New Testament? Anybody check? Side by side? And there are two sides of Christology, of the Pauline Christology. Let's grant it. We need a high-touch gospel for a high-tech world. Philippians, you're right on. But how are we ever going to challenge the city? Corruption. How are we ever going to bring about the peaceable city that God wants us to do? Read Isaiah 65, 17 to 25. 7 characteristics of what a city ought to look like. Offered to the Jerusalem rebuilders. Isaiah is saying, as you go back to rebuild your ruined city, let me tell you what I'm building heaven. And heaven's going to look like this. And it gives these 7 characteristics. So it's not an accident. If God's Spirit is in us, we want to, we have an idea what we want our city to look like. A number of years ago, I was at Wheaton College, and Billy Graham team was at the table with the president of Wheaton and some other people. And they invited 3 of us Chicago pastors to come out and give advice, tell us what we ought to do as a Christian college out here in the suburbs. And one of my Spanish friends, Manny Ortiz, who's now at Westminster Seminary, he said, well, I think you should all repent. Well, it's kind of hard to tell Billy Graham team they should repent. Ruth Graham was sitting there, and we almost lost the meeting at that point, I think. But cooler heads prevailed, and we came up with a lot of things, like Wheaton College could put their endowment in inner city banks, leverage the credit for inner city ministries. You could stop building dormitories on campus. You could put your 4th-year students in neighborhoods teaching cross-cultural. You do all kinds of things. We just went on and on and on with the dreams. And then one of the board members, who is a bond market owner and donated much of the millions in the account, said, Ray, when you and Bill and Manny talk about urban evangelism, I get very excited. But when you talk about urban justice and urban social ministry, and I get very nervous. Isn't this the social gospel? And I sort of breathed a prayer, grabbed the table, and because he put me on the spot, I said, Clayton, would you tell us where you live and why you live there? Sure. He gave the name of his rich suburb. Why do you live there? He said, well, it's very nice for my family. Safe, quiet, good schools. Housing values appreciate, isn't that good? Good stewardship. And I let him talk. He went on. And finally I said, Clayton, every reason for where you live is a social reason. If anybody believes the social gospel, it's you. You committed your whole life to it. Now, if those social conditions didn't exist, I hear you say, you would move your family. I said, I just want you to know, I agree with you. Those things are important. The only difference is you have them and many of us don't. So how could you tell us we should just preach the gospel? You don't believe that. By where you live, you've chosen to say, there's more than just preaching the gospel. My family deserves more than that. Well, if the church is growing the fastest in the most difficult social situations, how can we tell them, just preach the gospel? Well, we have all the goodies in our own community for our own family. Do you see that? There's a kind of hypocrisy in the evangelical circle. And I've heard it many, many times. And I tell people, if you came in and lived with me, with my family in my neighborhood, you wouldn't be saying, just preach the gospel. And the good news is, Jesus, the compassionate one, has given us Colossians as well as Philippians. They're side by side in the New Testament, but they came fractured in the church. We have to bring both sides of Paul together again to address these huge, humongous issues. The church in the marketplace, there's not one Vancouver, many Vancouvers. Convention Vancouver, athletic Vancouver, outdoor recreational Vancouver, University Vancouver, all kinds of Vancouver, media Vancouver, theater, art Vancouver, all of these Vancouvers. What does the gospel look like in each of these places? Now here I get to evangelism. Every person has most normal people have 4 worlds in which they live. A biological world of family, a geographical world of neighbor, a vocational world of work, and a recreational world of play. I could expound these, but let me move. In a rural area, we have those first 2, a biological world and a geographical world. So I was defined growing up, my name is Bakke and I live over there. You're known by your biology and your geography. In a city, when you ask people who they are, you've probably discovered, as I did years ago, they don't tell you who they are. What do they tell you? What they do. Oh, I work at Boeing, is what I heard years ago. And if the primary identity of people is where they work, then, Pastor, you've got to be thinking about, how do I get to their workplace? And how can I say to them, you are the missionary of this church in this building, your factory, your schoolroom. In other words, 100 people coming to listen to me as a small church in Vancouver. But suppose I have 100 people in 400 worlds with thousands of relationships. Suddenly my little church of 100 is huge. If I turn my hermeneutic of being a pastor from being a come structure, come listen to me, to a go structure, where people are entering their worlds, where primary relationships are built into the fabric of their life, knowing that 90% of Vancouverites become believers through relationships. How we steward our people in those networks becomes critical as a way of ministry. Let me mention some church specialties that I see these days. Obviously, the celebrative congregation. Black churches have been this way. I think this church is this way. Many of the contemporary churches are primarily defined by celebration. No problem. The city is a downer for many people. We need a place where the gospel comes alive, the music is vibrant, and people feel like they can celebrate. We also need churches to be extended family. Historically, that might have been a storefront, but today it's a cell church. A cell church, by definition, probably doesn't want to grow. You see, in the city, there are many people with ripped-off relationships. They need a place that's predictable. They honestly need a place that promises not to grow. We need some churches like that. We honestly do. Missional churches are growing today. Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., Gordon Cosby, every year they cancel the memberships back to zero and they recovenant. You cannot join the church. You had to join a mission group. And the mission group, when they feel that you've been discipled, they nominate you for church membership. I've been to churches where there'll be a small congregation, but they'll have millions of dollars worth of mission budgets. It's not unusual today for a church to have a housing corporation built thousands of houses in their communities, starting, I could name you churches like this. The Christian Community Development Association is a John Perkins network, been part of it since the beginning. This is a group that is going into the poorest communities in the country and now in about 29 nations overseas, where Christians deliberately move into the most crime and the poorest schools, the highest arrest records, and they live as relocators by intention to build relationships. They're not running programs. This is a specialization, the missional church. When I drive by the old churches, I call them Fifth Commandment churches. These are often mainline denominations. The youngest member may be 70 years old. These are the people who are pastoring yesterday's people. They're not going to come to praise and worship services. It's too loud. Everything has changed too fast. They're not contemporary. They're being pastored by memory, by stained glass, by tradition. I have a new respect for some of these old churches. My mom never had a baby the last 60 years of her life. She was bag lady worship. She worked in a grocery store bagging groceries for Safeway supermarket till she was 85, died at age 90. Her generation needs churches that can minister to them. There's a growing population of aging people. It is not everybody's desire that all the churches should be young, which is the graphic of church planting as I see most of you. Many people will be left out of this graphic. An aging city needs what I call fifth commandment models that honor fathers and mothers and care for the growing population that is around us. And then here's another urban specialization of church. The oldest churches in the history of Christianity are some of the newest churches in our city. Coptic Orthodox, Antiochian, Syrian Orthodox are now locating beside us. I tell my students, go find these ancient churches, walk into them, knock on the door and thank them for coming, but tell them, how can I pray for you? You obviously have family back in the war-torn areas of the Middle East or elsewhere in the world. I don't believe it's legitimate for us to try to steal their people and make them part of our churches. Oh, some may opt to go that way, and they are, truth be known. But I think our first response has to be to learn to hug them and thank them for 2,000 years of service. Aram Kashishian, the Catholicos, which is the patriarch of the Armenian Orthodox Church, said to a small group of us in Cyprus a few years ago, you Americans tend to think of the Great Commission as horizontal, 2,000 miles. Go everywhere in the world, preach the gospel. You can do that because your passport permits it. Ours does not. For us, the Great Commission is not 2,000 miles, it's 2,000 years. The gospel has been preached in this place for 2,000 years. Will it be, the Great Commission for us is, will there be gospel in this place for 2,000 years from now? The moment I heard that, I said, that's why we need each other. We have the privilege of going 2,000 miles, but I have no concept of what it means to be faithful in one spot for 2,000 years. That's what they can teach us. That's what they can teach us. That's their gift. They bring that gift to the table. I had one dinner with Billy Graham. We both spoke at her band in 1984 together, again in 87, but in 84, we listened to each other and then had dinner. And I asked him, Billy, what's the one thing you would say to a young minister like me that would be helpful? He said, 40 years ago, I made a vow that I would never say a negative word about any church or any pastor in a city or any place. He said, privately I may go to them, but publicly I will never criticize another church or minister. He said, even if I'm right, the devil will use it to divide the body. I made a vow I would be a body builder and not a body divider. That is written into the Lausanne Covenant in Article 8. Let's help the whole church take the whole gospel to the whole world. And I say whole church, whole gospel, whole city. And Billy said what he meant by that. The 5 families of the kingdom, he said, are Orthodox, Catholic, Conciliar with the World Council of Churches, Evangelical, Charismatic, Independent. He said, what I do is I run up the flag of Jesus and go with whoever salutes. In other words, he has a core but not boundaries around the gospel. That phrase, be a body builder. When I drive down a city street, I go by United Church of Christ, I may say to myself, that's Jonathan Edwards gone to seed. But I can thank that church for the Great Awakening that changed my country in 1740, along with John Whitfield, Jonathan Edwards. They were part of that church. And for a couple hundred years, they're the best game in town, coming out of New England. John Wesley's 313 years old this year. You drive by the Methodist Church, I say, hey, along with the Syrian Orthodox, you guys produced more churches and Christians than probably 2 churches in the history of the world. The last 100 years has been a little bit of a downer for many of them. But I can give thanks for the 200 years. I have gone by the Catholic Church in my community and knock on the door and I say, I owe you an apology. I've driven by your building and never stopped to thank you. I wouldn't be a Christian as a Norwegian probably if the German Ansgar hadn't crossed the Baltic in 834 and started baptizing Swedes. We were the violent Vikings. We had them for lunch a few times. They kept coming. 600 years, we mixed up Thor with Yahweh and the Freya legends with the Virgin Mary. We were screwed up people, but they kept coming. And then the Lutherans came, 1519, and made Lutherans out of us for 300 years. And finally, a group of 8 Swedes got out in the bay and baptized each other in 1848. I have a lecture called 1,000 Years to Make Vikings Baptist. That's my history. And I go to that church and say, if it weren't for you, I probably wouldn't be here as a Christian. But you kept coming to the most violent part of Europe. And that lesson is profound for me. I really believe that church planting movements often are seen as anti-other churches. That is, coming in on top of the churches. I would hope you would do what a missionary always does. Spend at least 20% of your time networking the community where you are, 1 day out of 5. Go visit every other church. Go visit the police department. Find out what are the calls for service. They're probably 70% are domestic violence related. That's our business. Spend the one day a week getting in touch with your community. Drive around it, pray around it, stop, talk to schools, invite the principal on Sunday morning. And I had the whole police department show up in my church. I went to them and said, you've been guarding us for 100 years. Bring the beat cops. I want to say thanks to you. It transformed everything in my church. The police all of a sudden became my friends. I had the fire department come. We had a thank you. We led the city in arson. And instead of complaining, we just got to know the fire people and had them come. You can do this. These are ways to respond to a city and to begin to care for a city. A city, it's not enough to minister in the city. Somebody has to minister to it. It is a gift of common grace. And that's a message I want you to see. I'm not only a pastor in a church, in a city, I'm pastor of a church for a city. I put the 2 arms of God are in Isaiah 40:11. Strong arm rules, and he will gently lead those who are with young, the tough and tender God. I think that's a pastoral image for me in a city. You put your arm around your church, yes, but you also put your arm around the community. Well, God help you. We'll come back.
We'll come back.
Q&A.
Thanks so much, Ray. We're going to do Q&A, but it'd be appropriate to show our thanks and appreciation to Ray. So much, I feel like a lame old Padawan interrupting a Jedi Master, Yoda here, the Yoda of urban missiology. So we've been drinking from the Ray Bakke fire hydrant, church history, theology as big as the city. Now's the opportunity for questions, or maybe you want him to drill into some application from some of the things he said. If you are joining us from across the country in Kelowna, Edmonton, Calgary, or Saskatchewan, or even Winnipeg, a big shout out to Winnipeg, you can text your questions to 604-996-1034, 604-996-1034, and if your questions are good, I'll put them to Ray. If they're lame, I'll just delete them. So thanks. But I'm going to wander the floor now and give you an opportunity to formulate some questions. If you want to stand, that way I'll find you in the dark, and then I'll give you the microphone. Thanks. Let's do that now.
And by the way, I love this. And if we can't answer every question, I'll give you my email and we'll keep in touch. Really appreciate the dialogue.
Appreciated what you said about sentient boundaries, you called them. If you could just say a little bit more, because I guess I sense that a number of them they're invisible boundaries often to us, okay? Mm-hmm. But they're very visible boundaries to others, and just a little bit more about how we become, aware of that.
I'll repeat your question as I understand it. Say a little more about sentient, S-E-N-T-I-E-N-T, boundaries. These are social psychological boundaries. The way people dress is a boundary. McLuhan taught us this. He's a Canadian communication scholar. Remember his aphorism? The medium is the message. In a visual world, let's say you have a singer on a Christian television broadcast, and their name is Legion, actually. I've seen many of them. And they're crooning into the microphone with glittering rings, bouffant hairstyle, gorgeously dressed, singing, "I'd rather have Jesus." What's really being communicated? Are you sure it's, "I'd rather have Jesus"? Or visually is something else being created? If all of your ushers are over 55 and wearing ties and white, the preacher can be saying, "You all come to Jesus, but, we know better." I walked into a church that had 34 flags hanging from the balcony. I said to the pastor in Miami, "Must be a missions conference." He said, "Oh no, these are the flags of our members. We have 34 nations now in our fellowship." I said, "How does that work?" He said, when we evangelize people here in Dade County in Miami, we give them a flag. And when they come to join the church, we plant that big flag right down by the communion table, and we welcome the flag into our church. Then he said, on the fourth Sunday of each month, we have a hospitality day, and we invite the newest member to nominate the food. So the newest member gets to stand up and say, "Welcome to my table. This is my food, coming from whatever country they come from. This is what the Lord talked about. The people who come at the last minute get the same pay as those who've been there." Right? That's the principle. Then he said, we give the flag to the art committee and we say, "Find some art from the countries that sent us our latest members." So the church looked like the Louvre Art Museum. Inside it's bamboo art, it's cloth, batik art, it's not expensive art, but everywhere in the church. And what he said to me was, "We want every child in Miami to know that Jesus is not a tribal God. Jesus brings the tribes together in this church." Then he said, we give the flag to the missions committee and say, "Find a sister church in the country that sent us his latest member." He said, we now have 34 sister congregations in 34 countries, and we exchange pulpits, we exchange pastors, work teams, mission groups, youth groups, sports groups, etc. And I went away saying the 7 last words of my church are, "We never did it that way before." This was amazing to me. But here's a church that was working at overcoming sentient boundaries. And when I asked where they got the idea for the flag, you know what they said? The bumper stickers in Miami say, "Will the last American to leave Miami please bring the flag?" That's hateful. And this church was responding to that by using the flag as a symbol of inclusion in their church. So sentient boundaries are important. The kind of music you use, the kind of dress you have, both includes and excludes people. That's what you need to know. Who are you including? Who are you, therefore, by including? Excluding, for whom another ministry must be different from you to include. The very fact that you can specialize in who you're trying to reach, gives permission for other people to have other ways of doing it. And sentient boundaries is something that we're now learning about. Very important idea. Yeah.
Just really quickly, can you just maybe talk a little bit about some of the effective things you've seen where churches come together to co-mission and work together for the betterment of the city and for effective disciple making in a city? There's a few of us here from the city of Victoria, city of about 400,000. Right now we have about 10 or 12 church planters who have agreed to come together with the idea of working for a greater overall mission, which is to see gospel saturation in our city. So we're not trying to just propagate our own churches, but one larger mission. So what are some things we can learn, or some things that you've seen that have been effective in trying to make that happen?
I hear you asking what are some of the signs of collaboration among churches that I'm seeing in cities. And the good news is I think churches are creating prayer movements where they pray together. I think there are also churches that are doing collaboratives on a variety of fronts. The new ecumenical reality is nobody is saying, give up your theology and your uniqueness to come and join a coalition. That's the old model of ecumenicity, where the lowest common denominator of belief became the way we partnered. The new one is bring your gift. If you're Anabaptistic, you have gifts. If you are Reformed, you have a gift. If you are X or Y or Z, you have a gift. Bring your gift to the table, because we need every gift in this city. And so I think that openness to see that the kingdom, and by the way, one time Jesus said, be born again. I said that. 34 times I think he said, follow me, and over 90 times talked about the kingdom. The church is never the end game in the New Testament. The church is a sign of and an agent for a kingdom agenda. The church is always pointing beyond itself. So church planning can't be the end game. The obvious end game is the gospel and a transformed kingdom, the transformed city. And we're looking for that. So we want to collaborate around those kinds of issues. One of the most hopeful movements in the United States and now around the world is the Leadership Foundation movement. If you will check out LF, the Leadership Foundations, you will see it grew out of Pittsburgh. Sam Shoemaker, bless his heart, Episcopal priest, used to take people up, pastors up, young life leaders, Youth for Christ leaders. He'd take them up on the hill above on Mount Washington, which is kind of like Grouse Mountain here. And you look out over the city and he'd say, gentlemen, because most of his time talking to men, behold your city. On your knees, men, let's pray. And out of that came the Pittsburgh experiment. And out of that came a leadership foundation. And the leadership foundations will sit down with the mayor and say, what are the 10 most significant problems in this city? They may say, well, drive-by shootings. They may say youth crime, prison populations. Whatever it is, the Leadership Foundation says, we're going to get churches to gather together and discuss how can we help on those agendas. We have resources, we have people. Let's work on that collaborative. I really like that movement. There's a brand new book out that they've produced. That's just one hopeful sign of what I see as collaborating.
Thanks for that, Ray. We've got a question from Calgary, and the questioner from beautiful Calgary in Alberta says, you've spent a lot of time talking about Paul's theology of the city. Did Jesus have a theology of the city, and what is the messianic theology of the city?
Did Jesus have a theology of the city and a missiology for the city? Indeed, he did. Obviously, Jesus looked out over Jerusalem. Matthew 22 and Luke 19. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that stonest the prophets and killest them that are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thee as a hen gathereth her chicks? And so on. You know those texts. But also, what did Jesus do in 9:35? Matthew 9:35 to 38. Basically, 4 verbal forms describes Jesus' methodology. First of all, paragesita, he went about the cities. Josephus said there were 305 cities in Galilee. The word city in that verse is polis, meaning diminutive, small cities. We would call them towns today. Jesus incubated the 12 in the cities. And then there are 3 verbal forms of what Jesus did in the cities. He preached, he taught, and he healed. Preached, caruso. He preached the gospel of the kingdom. And so we plant churches, right? He taught, so therefore we plant schools, right? He healed, and it's intensified with the Greek word pas, meaning all the diseases of the people. So if we're following Jesus' missiology of the city, we plant churches. First of all, we go about the city. We plant churches, we plant schools, and we plant clinics and hospitals. Right? That's Jesus' missiology. And what does he do? He says, pray for the Lord of the harvest for more people. He didn't go to Hong Kong or Johannesburg. He did the cities of his own area and came up with that message. And then as Matthew 9 ends, it says in chapter 10, verse 1, and he continued to go through the cities. In other words, the cities of Galilee. He knew that the disciples were still racist. They hadn't had the Spirit yet in all its fullness. Pentecost had not come. But he was using the cities around Galilee, basically, to disciple the 12. So he had a theology of the city. And he sent the church to the city. You go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost. But you're going to start here in the center of the city. The church was born in the city. The city Christ wept for, died in, and Pentecost came to that same city. Yeah.
Got a couple of questions, one from BC and one north of Calgary in Edmonton. The Edmontonian questioner asks, we seem to be a predominantly male Caucasian group of church planters. How do we go about breaking down that dominance in our churches? And where would you start?
Yeah. Well, I'm in a denomination that has women pastors and has always had. When I took my ordination vow, I understood the nature of the church is that when I baptize an adult believer, I'm ordaining them for ministry. So the church is the minister. When I gave up authority in the church, which I had as a member of the church, a minister of the church, to become a pastor of the church, I gave up authority to get responsibility. So I work under the church, not over the church. So in my ecclesiology, there's no reason a woman couldn't be a leader of a church. As a matter of fact, the only way I could stop that is not to baptize them, which seems counter to Jesus. Aren't we supposed to baptize people? And that, in my theology, I'm turning them into ministers. In many parts of the world, women are church leaders. They are missionaries. The most famous urban minister in my lifetime is Mother Teresa. The women are about 70% of the missionary workforce of the world are women. And they do it all. They function overseas like bishops. I say 70% of the world's cross-cultural workers, including pastors and missionaries, are women. So I think the good news is that the women were in the upper room filled with the Spirit along with the men. That was the good news. And women were leaders in the early church. Aquila, Priscilla. You hear the duo. You mentioned Phoebe. Lydia, there were leaders. And thank God it's still happening. And as I said, in many violent contexts, women will be far more effective as church leaders than men.
So part of the question also was to do with the Caucasian skew. You know, if we look around the room here in Vancouver, and that would probably be played out across the country in terms of those who are currently participating. How could we go about addressing that issue, Ray?
Yeah. Well, I'm a guest in your country. I don't know exactly how you do it here or why. I do know that most of the denominations in the world do not include women pastors at this point. And I'm talking about the Catholics, the Orthodox, and about 250 million others that would be in mostly evangelical or other groups. Whereas about 250 million Christians are in denominations that do ordain women. So it's a mixed reality for sure. But the majority of churches, not just evangelical, but Catholics and Orthodox, do not have women pastors at this point in time.
Okay, we got another question here. It says from Kelowna, when you say that there are some churches that shouldn't grow, how is this to be understood in light of obeying the Great Commission? I'm
suggesting that cell churches, which often function like an extended family, are very effective. I'm not saying they shouldn't grow, but I think most people who join a cell church are glad to have it not grow. And the reason that they're attracted to this is that they experience the city as a ripoff. Relationships come and go. And they want to be part of some group that stays. They feel like they don't have family in the city, so they look for a church to be family. This, by the way, is taking on many new forms. Many Korean 2.0 American-born Koreans are basically rejecting the traditional Korean church because they are rejecting the authoritarian pastor model. They don't want big daddy pastors spanking them from the pulpit now. They want brothers and sisters, so they go to Tim Keller's church in Manhattan instead of their Korean church in Queens. They're looking, in other words, for body life. They're looking for family. So churches can be family and growing, but I'm seeing a phenomenon of house church emerge where it's built on a discipleship model where they're keeping family as a paradigm. And they're really not having more spiritual children in that context. I'm also seeing families become members of more than one church. And this is also true in China. Many underground Christians now are also members of above ground churches. They maintain more than one membership because the churches meet different needs in their family. So there's just no one way to be church today. I think that's reality.